If you dread your Monday morning commute, imagine starting your workday knee-deep in human waste, or making yourself into an all-you-can-eat leech buffet, or maybe collecting the bloated corpses of plague victims with your bare hands. Welcome to the worst jobs of the Middle Ages, where work-life balance meant having enough strength left to dig your own grave when the job finally killed you. Life in medieval Europe was brutal. While today we complain about bad Wi-Fi and uncomfortable office chairs, medieval workers faced challenges slightly more pressing, like not dying before lunch. These weren't just unpleasant jobs. They were cruel and unusual death sentences with a salary. In a world without sewage systems, someone had to deal with human waste. That someone was the gong farmer, and they had a truly crappy job. Picture a man descending into a cesspit beneath a city street, shoveling centuries of accumulated human excrement with his bare hands. The pits release toxic gases like methane and hydrogen sulfide. One spark and the whole pit could explode. Medieval workplace safety at its finest. Gong farmers could only work at night, by royal decree. They were so foul-smelling they weren't allowed on daytime streets. The pay? A few pennies per ton of night soil. In London, these workers formed their own guild called the Company of Night Soilmen, probably the only professional organization where members avoided shaking hands at meetings. Most died in their 20s, their lungs destroyed by toxic fumes, making their retirement planning wonderfully simple. The leather jacket has always been in style, but in medieval times, it came with a side of nightmare. The tanning process was chemical warfare against the human body. First ingredient, urine. Lots of it. Second ingredient, dog feces, which contains enzymes that soften leather. Tanners would collect dog droppings from streets, mix them with water, and knead this mixture into hides with their bare hands. And you thought your job was hands-on. Few tanners lived past 40. Their fingers often rotted away, their lungs destroyed by chemicals they breathed daily. But hey, at least they produced nice shoes. Tanners were so reviled that many medieval towns had laws forcing them to live in designated districts. When the Black Death swept through Europe, someone had to deal with the rats. Enter medieval Europe's first pest control specialists, with an exceptionally high chance of catching the very disease they were working to eliminate. Rat catchers crawled through the filthiest spaces in medieval cities, using bare hands or primitive traps. They were paid by the tail, which led to some entrepreneurial types breeding rats on the side. Medieval capitalism at its finest, creating more of the problem you're paid to solve. And get this, a man named Jack Black became known as Queen Victoria's official rat catcher, and was documented to have trained rats that would crawl up and down his arms and even inside his shirt. He often used these trained rats in public demonstrations to showcase his skills and promote his services. A true rat master. Beneath medieval streets lurked the Toscher, essentially a sewer-dwelling treasure hunter with extremely low standards for what constituted treasure. These unfortunates waded through chest-deep sewage searching for coins, jewelry, or anything of value. The air was so toxic they worked in groups, dragging out teammates who passed out from fumes. But there was an even larger occupational hazard. Sudden floods could wash Toshers away, never to be seen again. The medieval equivalent of working remotely, except no one would ever find your body. Surprisingly, Toshers developed an elaborate code of honor, with strict territories and rules about who could search where. The most valuable finds weren't gold or silver, but simple metal items that could be melted down without questions about origin. Many Toshers carried a long pole called a mudlark to steady themselves and to probe for items. Medieval medicine's obsession with bloodletting created massive demand for leeches, and so someone needed to collect these. Enter the leech collector, a particularly draining job. These brave souls waded into stagnant marshes, offering themselves as bait, letting leeches attach to their legs before collecting them. By day's end, they could lose pints of blood, often becoming so weak they collapsed in the very waters where they worked. Talk about taking your work home with you. The most successful leech collectors developed calloused, leathery legs from years of bites, wearing their occupational scars like a grotesque uniform. During peak medical demand in the 13th century, a single collector might supply thousands of leeches monthly to physicians. Those soft woolen garments worn by medieval nobles, they were processed by fullers, people who took immersing yourself in your work far too literally. Fullers cleaned wool by stomping it in vats, filled with water, urine, and Fuller's earth. The key ingredient was human urine collected from public urinals, medieval recycling at its finest. The chemicals ate away at their skin, causing sores and discoloration. Many went blind from ammonia vapors. Fuller's smelled so strongly of urine, they lived in segregated communities. The original work-from-home mandate, except it wasn't to prevent plague, it was because you were socially toxic. In larger towns, Fuller's operated in buildings called fulleries, where the stench was so powerful that birds reportedly fell dead from the sky when flying overhead. Most Fullers began their careers as children as young as 6. Their small bodies perfect for stomping in narrower vats. Sounds like a fun bring-your-child-to-work day. Safe to say, medieval career counselors weren't exactly setting the bar high. Speaking of kids, in medieval palaces lurked the most psychologically devastating job of all, the whipping boy. Since royal tutors couldn't punish princes directly, they selected noble-born children to absorb all punishment the prince earned. These kids received fine education and food, with daily beatings as the employment benefits package. Some princes grew fond of their whipping boys and behaved well. Others became sadistic, breaking rules to watch someone else suffer. Medieval workplace politics hasn't changed much, has it? The most famous whipping boy, Barnaby Fitzpatrick, served the young King Edward VI of England and was reportedly beaten so severely on the king's behalf that he once couldn't leave bed for a week. Ironically, successful whipping boys sometimes rose to positions of power as adults, their shared childhood trauma creating lifelong bonds with monarchs, an example that should make modern networking seem a little less unbearable. Not all terrible medieval jobs were done by the poor. Plague doctors came from educated backgrounds but faced almost certain death. History's first example of higher education not really paying off. Behind those iconic beaked masks, which did absolutely nothing to prevent infection by the way, these physicians applied cures like herbal poultices, mercury, or live toads to plague victims' swollen lymph nodes. Surprisingly, none of these worked. Medieval medicine, where the treatment was often worse than the disease. At the height of the plague, most died within months of taking the position. The few survivors turned to alcohol, haunted by dark memories of the devastating disease. The medieval version of burnout was somewhat more permanent than ours. However, plague doctors were often paid 6 times the salary of regular physicians, making them one of the earliest true examples of hazard pay. Many were actually second-rate doctors or medical students who couldn't succeed in regular practice, meaning plague-stricken towns were paying premium rates for medicine's D students. The contracts they signed often included provisions for their own funerals. Talk about a comprehensive benefits package with the minor downside that you'd be almost guaranteed to use it. Speaking of death, medieval people feared dying with unconfessed sins. And believe it or not, there was a job to fix this. Enter the Sin Eater, a person who, for pocket change, would eat bread placed on a corpse, symbolically absorbing the dead person's sins. The ultimate, I'll take that off your hands, service. Sin Eaters existed on society's fringes, shunned as walking repositories of evil. They couldn't enter churches or public houses and were forbidden from making eye contact with decent folk. The psychological burden was crushing. These people believed they were consuming evil, ensuring their own eternal damnation. Most became alcoholics. Turns out, collecting other people's moral failings drives you to drink. Some workplace traditions never change. In Welsh border communities, sin eaters were often homeless individuals or those with mental illnesses who had no other options for survival. They typically charged a 6p per corpse, roughly equivalent to a day's wages for an agricultural worker, for the privilege of condemning their immortal soul. Some families would reserve a sin eater in advance, paying them small amounts throughout life to ensure they'd be available when needed. History's most morbid retainer agreement. Career advancement meant simply finding wealthier corpses with more expensive sins to consume. While executioners had status, their assistants lived nightmares beyond imagination, easily on of history's worst intern positions ever. Their job? Handling fresh corpses and bodily fluids after executions. But their real specialty was the dirty work of torture, applying the red-hot pincers, turning the rack, and operating crushing devices. They heard every scream and plea as victims begged for mercy. The original terrible customer service position. Many assistants were prisoners given a choice between execution or taking this job. perhaps history's worst job interview question. In some regions, these assistants lived in the execution chamber itself, sleeping among the instruments of torture they operated daily. They wore special clothing that marked them as untouchable, often red gloves or hoods that they were forbidden to remove in public. The psychological toll was so severe that many developed a condition medieval physicians called torturer's melancholy, marked by vivid nightmares, uncontrollable trembling, and hallucinations of past victims. Today, we would call this severe PTSD. But of course, they were told to deal with it and received absolutely zero mental health benefits. What's most haunting about these professions isn't just the suffering, but the isolation that spread into their personal lives. These workers became untouchables, humans treated as something less. They lived outside city walls, couldn't worship with others, and their children couldn't play with other children. Entire families lived and died in these conditions, creating underclasses that persisted for centuries. Their suffering wasn't random, it was systemic, organized by societies that needed their labor but couldn't bear to acknowledge their humanity. Sound familiar? Most of these professions vanished with industrialization and modern medicine, but some lingered longer than you'd think. Rat catchers worked London until the 1950s. Sin eating continued in Wales into the early 20th century, and globally, millions still work in conditions disturbingly similar to their medieval counterparts. The next time you flush a toilet, take medicine, or complain about your Zoom background, spare a thought for those whose suffering paved the way for our comfort. History isn't written just by kings and conquerors. It's etched into the bones of ordinary people who did what they had to do to survive. Makes your upcoming performance review seem a little less terrifying, doesn't it?